Welcome, everyone. I forgot to unmute us.
Oh, we were muted.
Yeah,
Brilliant. Okay.
yeah,
Hello everybody.
yep. So
God,
this,
I love that. I did really well there as well.
so yeah, yeah. Thanks for tuning into this.
Welcome all again to another one of these insane podcasts that we're going to be doing.
All right. Well, I suppose let's just get straight into it then.
Yeah, right. What are we doing today then, Connor?
Today we are doing Atlantis and Hyperborea, the story of two Europes.
Full on shit. Hell yeah.
So this is basically um there's like a myth motif, you could say, in the idea that there's like two spheres
Mm,
within Europe, and they're kind of like mainly to do with like the cultural expression of um, different peoples.
mm-hmm.
And this comes across in spiritual terms, and it comes in sorry, um that should be it now. Sorry, the hotkey wasn't working there.
All right. So it
Right.
comes in spiritual terms and also, I mean, there was also like a blunt geographic kind of directionality thing going on.
Yeah. Basically it's um right. There's
One
two.
day we'll have no teething problems. One day we'll do one of these and it'll be absolutely flawless.
um right. No. Um Sorry. Just give me a second. Okay. Atlantis and Hyperborea. Basically, you've got these two spheres. So one is associated with the north, the east, um, the suppose you could say well, I'll just launch straight into it, like get into like what these terms mean. But
Yeah,
basically, this
go for it.
is a culmination of the research that we've done into
Mm,
how Europe is not, and don't really think ever has been like a singular entity. It's kind of made up
hmm.
of these two spheres. And this isn't an original
Mm.
idea of ours. Other people have talked about this before, but we have,
No.
you should say, like our own take on it. You know. So
Yeah, I think we've refined it in a particular way and in particular directions that other people maybe haven't. I mean, we've tacked on a lot of the kind of genetic research, I think, in ways that, I mean, well, we kind of were at one point almost at the forefront of that in terms of being cutting edge and looking at the papers as they were coming out, and or maybe not so much now, but
yeah.
oh, cool.
So yeah. To start with, we've got Hyperborea. So uh,
Mm,
all of these, both of these terms, Hyperborea and Atlantis, are from the Greeks. So Hyperborea
hmm.
means beyond the north wind. The idea behind Hyperborea, so like this,
Mm,
whenever people say Hyperborea, they tend to conjure up images in this sort of picture here. So it's like it's in the far north, so it's snow covered, and the mammoths and all that kind of stuff.
and people ride mammoths because that's totally legit, and we
Yeah.
definitely did that.
Um, but the actual Greek conception of Hyperborea was that it was actually a very like sunny place, because it was beyond the north wind, and the
Hmm.
north wind brought the cold. Uh, then it was it was very sunny and warm, and but they did say that they thought that the sun would only rise and set once a year. which does sound a lot like the Arctic Circle,
It does indeed,
which
doesn't it?
which is not very warm at all. It's most of the year it
It's
is.
actually rather cold, as far
Yeah,
as I've
yeah,
heard. Yeah, it's funny that,
yeah.
Yeah.
So it was first mentioned by Herodotus in around about 450 BC, and he was referencing Greek poet Aristeas. Homer is also supposed to have mentioned it. And the Hyperboreans, as a people, like the Greeks said that they lived for 1,000 years in complete contentment. But some actually found this pretty
Yeah.
boring, so they just decided to cover themselves in garlands and chuck themselves from the mountains.
As you do when you're
Yep.
bored of your millennial existence. Clad yourself in flowers, throw yourself off a mountain. Yeah, standard practice. I've done it myself.
So the thing is, though, in as far as the Greeks were concerned, the Hyperboreans were a real people. It's just that they couldn't quite agree on who exactly they were. So some Greeks associated them with the Celts. But when you read Herodotus, like he makes it quite clear that the Hyperboreans, they are people, but they're not Scythians. They're sort of in contact with the Scythians. So as far as like a real people go, the Hyperboreans, they would seem to be living probably in like Siberia somewhere, or Northern Europe.
Yeah, either that or it's like Perm, or it's some of those bits of what's now Russia that. I mean, if we're talking back in those times, I mean, were they Indo-European speaking? Were they Uralic, Ugric people, or who knows, really?
I think it would
Probably Indo-European,
most.
but
I would think it would mostly be Uralic, actually, round about that kind of area,
oh
because
yeah.
yeah,
I mean, for me, I mean, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. For me, Hyperborea is like all of Siberia, so that would be mostly Uralic, I guess, but also some other stuff too.
yeah, but a bunch of Tungusic and what were some of the other like
Exactly.
just like these quite obscure sorts of groups. But there's a
Yeah.
legend about a man called Abaris the Hyperborean, and he was a legendary sage healer, and he was a priest of Apollo. Apollo is supposed to have come from Hyperborea. So Abaris is said to have eaten no food, and to have traveled with an arrow which he flew on, and that he's supposed to have purified Sparta and Knossos from plagues. So there's definitely the
Fair
Hyperborean.
enough. I mean, that's very Apollonian, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's the thing about it, is that the Greeks seem to associate the Hyperboreans with healing powers. So that's pretty interesting
Cool.
itself. So first of all, they were real people. Some people thought they were cyclopes and giants and stuff like that, but the Greeks did conceive of them as a real people.
Which again, the idea of like Cyclopes and Gigantes being monstrous, I think, is a sort of subsequent development. And as far as I've been able to tell from some of the earlier Greek stories, they're just sort of tribes that have some partial descent from potentially divine figures. Like that's kind of it.
Yeah,
They're like Titan spawn or something like that. Right. That doesn't necessarily mean that they've only got the one eye or that they're monstrous in any way, but they end up being depicted like that further down the line. So it could be that they were thought of as Cyclopes for, I suppose that is a one-eyed thing. I don't know. I've read a lot of weird shit about all of that and what that's supposed to be.
yeah. So yeah, that's the Hyperboreans. Basically, real people. This is a legend among the Greeks about a far off land. When we get to Atlantis, it's a little bit different, because as far as we can tell, Atlantis was actually the name of a daughter of Atlas, the giant. And it was first used in the 5th century BC in that context. But Plato, he used it as an allegory for hubris. So he basically claimed that round about 306. Well, no, he was around about 360 BC. He claimed that it was an island in the Atlantic that was given to Poseidon, and he then made Atlas the king of it, and then his brothers were like sub-kings. The Atlanteans then conquered the lands in the Mediterranean, and Athens was left as like the last stand, basically against it. And because of its hubris, Atlantis was sunk by the gods. So, and that's yeah.
Yeah.
So despite being a fictional allegory, as far as we can tell, so rather than compared to Hyperborea is like an authentic legend of this, like, oh yeah, there's this far off.
That was
land.
a real place that you could go if you travelled. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Atlantis.
Whereas Atlantis is, I mean, isn't there some story about he got this tale from the Egyptian priests or something?
Yes, but again, like they've archaeologists have looked into that, and all they can find is that Atlantis is the name of one of Atlas's daughters. So
that's all that they can find. So there's no connection with Egypt that we can work out at this point.
Well, the poem, I'm pretty sure the poem that mentions Atlantis is from Egypt. It's a Greek poem, because obviously at the time the Greeks...
Oh, okay.
Oh, no, wait.
Yeah.
Greeks in charge of Egypt at that point. No, actually. No. So,
not before the 4th century, 3rd century?
No. Yeah, so yeah, there is supposed to be some connection with Egypt, but again, as far as the name goes,
there wouldn't have been Greek-speaking people walking around in Egypt at that time writing poetry.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, they're just the other side of the Mediterranean, so
yeah,
it doesn't say much. But yeah, okay, so, but at any rate, I mean, presumably then, even if it's a story among the Egyptians, to them, it's also an allegory talking about hubris. It's you know,
yeah,
take not thy thunder from us, but take away our pride, that kind of thing.
So, yeah, I mean, it's despite the fact that it seems to be an allegory rather than like a real place, it's pretty like it's much better known in popular culture than Hyperborea is.
Yeah.
That my suspicion is
for some reason.
Yeah. Well, my suspicion is that has to do with our particular civilization and its sort of orientation, as it were, which is very much influenced by. I mean, you look at the kind of architecture here. It's like our civilization has all of this going on, whereas Hyperborea is like that's a bunch of like.
It's more rugged looking, and when people imagine it, when people make their sort of artistic depictions, it's all done in wood, and you know, people are using furs and skins and things, and it's still like, in its way, people depict high architecture and high civilization, but it seems like it's often more connected with its environment, whereas part of the idea with Atlantis, I suppose, is that they entered into some kind of disconnection with their environment, and that led to them being flooded. Yeah,
and obviously, like the whole thing is very artificial. Like it's well, to be fair, I mean it's it was built on an island, so it's not as if the island was artificial. But the general
could have been. You never know. It might have been that when the aliens came down, they built an artificial island to house all of their gold-gathering slaves on.
But I suppose the point is that it's supposed to be like like this lost, sunken city, and you know, it's allegory for hubris. So it's like I find it interesting that, you know, our civilization seems to have so much in common with Atlantis, and that's the allegory in the context it's used for.
You'd really hope that we had more in common with Hyperborea, because that would mean that we'd have a more harmonious civilization somewhere, which is not to say that this is the thing as well. It's not to say that there's anything necessarily better or worse about the far north of the old world compared to the Atlantic Ocean or something like that. because that's the other way in which people use these terms, Hyperborean and Atlantean, is to talk about, well, some people come from the northeast and some people come from the west, and or more or less that's how people divvy it up in their heads. It's sort of there's a certain degree to which we've got to tease between the ancient motifs, how people were using them back then, and how people use these terms nowadays, because it's not really, I think, the case if you go back in archaeology and look at what is legitimately Atlantean in the sense of being on the shores of Atlantis. It doesn't really look that much like what we've got in this image here. It doesn't look so much like kind of sunken Greco-Roman palatial cities and all that jazz. It's a little bit more rustic, down to earth, and sort of in tune with its surroundings, maybe.
It is, although I have to. That's why what we'll be getting into today is the ways in which there is still like a they will be focusing more on like the modern sort of conception of it, because that reflects something quite real in all of the migrations to Europe, the directions people have been coming from, and things like that. These mythological motifs are kind of just used to describe that, which is like what you've just said. I mean, just a few more things about Atlantis. I mean, it's like whenever people heard about they found out the Americas, they wondered, it's like, oh, did Plato know about the Americas? Is it the Americas? And there is this idea that all the civilizations in the world descend from Atlantis. But I suppose Atlantis can maybe be used just as like a allegory for civilization itself. So
this is the thing, the idea that it got flooded and everything. I mean, I think Hancock talks about some of that kind of stuff anyway, but it does. His idea is that there was this whole global civilization that existed more than 10, 12,000 years ago. And that the reason everybody's got pyramids and stuff is, because they've ripped it off of these old guys, or it's just the knowledge has disseminated itself over time. People have picked it up a little bit here and there, and we've sort of halfway rebuilt some of the stuff. But I think he's of the opinion that they actually were somehow more harmonious and sort of in tune with sort of etheric and telluric currents, and building, their power sources were coming out of the earth and the sky. And I can't remember how he goes on with it, but that kind of stuff. I wanted to make one quick point about Atlantis as a naval empire. One of the reasons I think why a lot of certainly modern nation states coming up in the 19th into the 20th centuries identified much more strongly and much more readily with Atlantis than Hyperborea is because it was a naval empire. I mean, what do they call it? A thalassocracy or something. So they're running things. That's a lot. There we go. They're running. It's all to do with naval strength and running the waters. And before the invention of aviation, that was how you managed massive intercontinental, colonial empires. That's what people were doing with the British, the French, the Spanish. Well, I mean, mostly them, but that sort of became the defining feature of a truly up-to-date modern superpower about 150 years ago, when all the Atlantis stuff was suddenly becoming very, very, people were getting into it. It must have been, I mean, I think I saw a little peek of your next slide talking about the esoteric aspects and getting on to some, theosophy and that kind of stuff. Because that is, I think, where the interest in Atlantis really started to skyrocket, wasn't it?
Well,
and Hyperborea as well,
Ignatius Donnelly, the guy that claimed that all civilizations descend from Atlantis, he put out his book in 1882. Helena Blavatsky put out her book, The Secret Doctrine, in 1888. So it's the 1880s where really kind of Atlantis is really coming into the popular consciousness, like this idea. So she had like her theory was basically she claimed that it was like revealed wisdom from Tibetan masters. But basically her idea was that mankind has gone through stages of spiritual evolution or devolution. It depends on what way you want to look at it. But basically, the Atlantean. No, sorry. First, you have what's called the polar stage, and that's kind of like a very spiritually pure state. The second one is the Hyperborean, and apparently people or humans, whatever, they reproduced by budding, so like bacteria.
Terrifying.
Yeah. The third stage is I can't remember what it's Lemurian. So that's when people laid eggs.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
and
Also
then
terrifying.
the fourth stage is the Atlantean, and that's when people start to build civilization and so on. But it was used as like a by other esotericists. So that a little bit later, René Guénon, Julius Evola, they used Hyperborea as a metaphor for a pure spiritual state, like that we've since sort of declined from. What I want to focus on today, though, mainly, is this guy Alexander Dugin.
For God's sake.
He is an esotericist, is a Russian esotericist, and he is very much a Russian nationalist. And his idea is basically that there's, we have these two spheres. We've got Russia representing Eurasia, and you've got the West representing the Atlantic. So that's like the rest of Europe and the Americas. And what's interesting is that he associates Russia and Rome with Hyperborea. And he
Twat.
Well.
Twat. Just, no. What are you talking about, you fucking weirdo? Sorry. This guy gets on my nerves sometimes. God.
Well, I mean, as we'll discover, I think that there's something to what he is saying. It's just that it's more.
No, exactly. That's what I mean, though. That's what pisses me off, is that he's got those little like threads of good stuff in what he says, and then he swings it in some way completely fucking retarded that just serves like this modern Russian, nation state interests. Seems to be his thing.
Yeah. It's
hang on. So he associates Rome and Russia with Hyperborea and Carthage.
No. Sorry, I've
Carthage
made that...
in the West. Gotcha. Sorry, no, that's just me misreading it. Gotcha.
Yeah,
Carthage in the West
I
associated
put the
with
in the
Atlantis.
thing. But yes, no, Carthage is associated with the West, so that's kind of again.
We was Kangs. What?
Well, there's something to that. I mean, in what you were just saying about the Thessalocracy thing, that's what Carthage was.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So I'm going to approach this by looking at like all of the migrations into Europe from the very earliest days, and this is basically the whole points to why I'm talking about this today, because it does go pretty deep into Europe's like what Europe is, and like the contrast between like the different cultures that you find here. So even though like to some people like Europe is a distinct entity, and it is in a certain sense, you can definitely make a case for that. But in another sense, it is also like this. We have tended to find that this idea of like the Hyperborean and Atlantis thing it definitely reflects something genuine, and that I think that we can demonstrate this by looking at the genetic evidence to find like when people were moving in and so on. But of course, it's not like a purely genetic thing. Like the Hyperborean Atlantis thing is about, like I said, cultural, spiritual spheres.
Yeah.
But of course, like they're brought in by.
If it were about genetics alone, you might expect a load of. Sorry.
Huh?
I was just going to say, if it were about genetics alone, you might expect a load of people to have come across the sea from the west, which I've got to say, we don't have any evidence of that happening as far as I'm aware.
Well, let's get into it then. So we'll go back very, very far back, all the way to before our particular subspecies of human lived here, which is the Neanderthals. Now, they've found that the Neanderthals...
Varg's people.
God's people.
Varg's people.
Varg's... Yeah.
Vargs.
Yeah, so obviously... Yeah, so for anybody that doesn't know, Varg Vikernes, I suppose, believes that Europeans are basically Neanderthals. So, not going to comment on it. Point being, though, that something that's I find quite interesting is that there's another group called Denisovans, ancient group in East Asia. There's a few people like, Papua New Guinea.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've got a little bit of admixture from the Denisovans.
Yeah.
But the split between Neanderthals and Denisovans is kind of reflective of the split between West Eurasians later on and then East Eurasians, So like with our species.
Yeah, I get you on that.
So it's this thing of like, the Eastern and Western, although these seem to have been two different species and are obviously dealing with much longer time spans. I couldn't find a reliable date for when the Neanderthals are supposed to have come into being, so I just put like until about 40,000 years ago they were around.
It's like hundreds of thousands of years. Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
But the point is that geneticists have found that the Neanderthals can be split into these three groups. So, I mean, for our purposes today, I suppose the Eastern group is not quite so relevant. But it's interesting that you have the Northern group, and they seem to have come into Europe through the Caucasus. And then you have a Southern group, which probably came from the Middle East. We don't actually have any samples from the Middle East, so we can't really compare them. But we can actually observe differences between Neanderthals in the northern and southern parts of Europe. So apparently the southern Neanderthals, they had less protrusive jaw and a shorter gap between the molars, vertically higher jawbone. So that they did look different, like, and they're pretty genetically distinct. So you've got, it seems, one group coming into Europe from the Caucasus area, but they may have more connection to the Caucasus area, and they're the more sort of northern group. And then you've got the other one, which looks like it came in from the Middle East, having more of a connection with there.
So what, via Anatolia? Or...
Yeah.
I'm guessing that they didn't sail across the Mediterranean at that point.
No.
Although you never know, they might have done. They might have had wind-powered alien ships.
Point being, though,
powered by pyramids. You never know.
Yeah. Point being, though, like, there's.
So, just a quick question.
Yeah.
But is there like cultural difference between these two groups then? Like, can we tell from, like the tools that they were using or any of the remains that they've left behind? Did they act differently from one another, or did they just look different?
I didn't look deep enough into it to find out that.
I don't know.
I don't know. Yeah, no, it's I just know the genetic stuff. But I would expect there was cultural differences.
Fair enough.
There was mixing between the two groups as well. So. Right.
And just so this blue group off in the east, the reason that we're not treating them very much is because they don't. Is it that they don't really contribute very much to humans going forward, or
no? That's the interesting thing about it. So modern day East Asians, they actually have the most Neanderthal admixture, but it doesn't come from this Eastern group. I don't think. I think it actually is supposed to come from the more that sort of northwestern one.
Yeah,
which is interesting. So that the earliest Homo sapiens coming in, I don't actually know about Zlati Kun woman here. But basically, the Zlati Kun woman is the earliest Homo sapien, or Homo sapiens, that we have in Europe. And her genetic profile, it's like it predates the split between the East and the West Eurasians. So she can't be her genes are sort of ancestral to both. She can't be distinguished, which that does mean that we don't really know which direction her people would have come into Europe from exactly. It's not totally clear. But it's interesting though the fact that the ones that came after her, so basically the earliest Europeans, like they had more in common with East Asians than modern day Europeans. You'll notice as well here that the little black bits of the pie chart, those are, well, it's technically like pre-Homo sapiens admixture, but it's basically Neanderthal. So this guy in particular, like Oasa 1 and Bacho Kiro, they had a decent amount of Neanderthal admixture. So, but as you can see as well, like they're the haplogroups of these guys. So Ustashim man is here in is actually in Siberia, so it's technically not Europe. But you know these guys had the same haplogroup, and it's related to haplogroup NO. So O you get mainly in East Asia, N you get up in the north of Siberia, and that's just to emphasize the fact these people are East Asians, and they're coming into Europe via the steppe. And it's interesting that they are the earliest ones, because it implies that the easiest way to get into Europe was from the steppe, not from Anatolia or the Mediterranean or anything like that. So the next wave probably did come from Anatolia. And they were much more like modern Europeans. So map here shows basically all of the darkest red. That is all of the people that are most like them. And the Finns are the most like this one here, Kostenki, in Western Russia. And what's happening here is basically that so you have this East Asian group to start with, and they have a decent amount of Neanderthal admixture. But then this other group from Anatolia is coming in, and they're absorbing the locals. Because, you know, what's interesting, for example, is like with this map for Kostenki man, see this little really green bit in China, where that's where the people there have the least in common genetically, more or less, with Kostenki man. That's where his haplogroup is most common.
Yeah, I mean, that just goes to show the difference between haplogroups and autosomal admixture.
Yeah, so it's fascinating in this sense that it's like the people, or some of the people in this area, they have like the same direct paternal descent as this guy did, but their genetic profile was completely different, and the reason for that would have been that this man, Kostenki 14, he would have been he had direct paternal descent from East Asia, but most of his ancestors would have come in from Anatolia, you know. So, and that just seems to have been what happened in Europe at this time. But it's similar sort of things happened a bit later on. You can see as well up here, Goyet, there's definitely a mix. So they've got like mostly this new sort of Anatolian with the Aurignacian culture. And but they've still got a little bit of that East Asian admixture left. And this sample is a woman, and her maternal lineage is East Asian, for example. But what happened at this time that's quite interesting is that we can also see that some of these people, the Aurignacians, moved eastward, and they mixed with different group of East Asian people to form a group known as the ancient North Eurasians, who will become relevant in Europeans' history a little bit, Europe's history a little bit later. This that I've got here is just to demonstrate with haplogroups, like how we know that the Aurignacians came from Anatolia. So on the left, you've got Kostenki 14's haplogroup. And on the right, you have the sister clade of that haplogroup, and as you can see, it's most common in Jordan. So this is so even though haplogroup U, like the U2 is mainly European, a lot of the other U subclades are European. They've really come from the Middle East. It's the same with haplogroups or haplogroup I. Haplogroup I is very European. Like, it's specifically European. So, like, what seems to have happened is these people, they had a common root with Middle Eastern people. So, but they split, and they kind of they didn't really mix again with each other. Well, they did a little bit, but I'll get to that. The point
Tiny
is
bit,
that
yeah.
the Europeans have become basically kind of isolated from the other Middle Eastern people during the Ice Age specifically. And here's just like a few examples of Aurignacian art. So the kind of stuff that these Europeans, like this is, earliest genetic Europeans were creating. As you can see, they were very into lions. The statues are made of mammoth bones, so Europe was a very different place. We had mammoths, we had rhinoceros, we had hyenas, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
No saber-toothed tigers as far as we can tell, but but yeah, like that. So they had they had an emphasis on animals and the human body in their artistic expressions. Which makes sense. So once we get into this next sort of stage, there is a period in between the Aurignacian or after the Aurignacian called the Gravettian, but it's basically just when the that's like a period of consolidation for the Aurignacians that have settled in Europe. Cultures become more regionally distinct, and like you start to get a bit more of a separation, genetic. Like the groups in different parts of Europe become a little bit more genetically distinct from each other, and culturally distinct. But it's during this period in particular, the Epigravettian, that's when you get this second movement from the east coming in. So first movement is like the earliest Europeans, it seems. So then you get a second movement coming up from Anatolia, and then there's another eastern movement coming in. And these people have the ancient North Eurasians. They came from Siberia originally, and they moved through, and then they picked up what's called Gadrosian genes. Now, Gadrosia is an area between Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and these people would have picked up genes from the people living in Central Asia, that kind of area, on their way through to Europe. And that's an important point because that is something that does repeat itself later on. So the point here is that you've got this kind of east to west kind of thing going on. You've got the what's called the Magdalenian culture. That's mainly in Western Europe, and they're mostly replaced by groups from further east. So the groups from further east, they're genetically distinct. They're becoming genetically distinct from the Magdalenians, and they're mixing with the ancient North Eurasians that are coming in. So yeah, that's why you have this kind of cline here. And another point that I want to make about this is that, like, until this point, Europe has been generally pretty cold.
Yeah.
But as this period ends, it's starting to warm a lot more. So, especially on the, in southern Europe and on the Atlantic coast, it became a lot milder. So, next stage we have the Neolithic. So that's people doing agriculture. They're not hunter-gatherers anymore. They are moving in from Anatolia, seemingly because there's a population growth. Because they produce food, so they can feed more people. So then the population grows, and so it gets crowded, and so some people, they want to move away, and that's how they end up expanding.
Beginning of the end.
What's interesting though about the early European farmers, they actually descend from a group of these Western hunter-gatherers. So like these Europeans that have mixed with the ancient North Eurasians actually moved into Anatolia and mixed with the local people there. And then that's your Anatolian hunter-gatherers. And then they mixed with other people from a bit further south and from the east as well. So basically, you've got like the people already living in Anatolia. They were a lot like the people living here in the Levant. To start with, you have Western hunter-gatherers coming in, mixing with them, and then in the Neolithic, you have more people come up from the south, and some people coming up from the east, from the Caucasus, and that's your early European farmers. They then move into Europe, and they basically replace, they assimilate the local hunter-gatherers, and they obviously have a very different lifestyle. They're sedentary. They tended to do communal burial and cremation rather than the individual burial kind of style that you had before that. And their diet was also very different. So because they're farming crops and so on, they've got a pretty plant-based diet, which interestingly enough, they've actually found that a lot of the hunter-gatherers in the Middle East and North Africa had mainly plant-based diets anyway. So it's interesting that, because people do tend to think of hunter-gatherers as having more
lots of meat, or fish at least. But no, a lot of them actually. I mean, still today, you get a lot of hunter-gatherer tribes that are predominantly vegetarian, I guess, but they will hunt or fish, as needed, I suppose.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the kind of that's the kind of thing we're dealing with here, which is again, it's interesting once you go like further down the line and you start to get these patterns cropping up. So like in the Cucuteni Dropilia culture, this is in sort of like Western Ukraine and Romania, that kind of area. You start to get these really, really big settlements.
Yeah.
So they're absolutely massive. And also a little bit further south in Bulgaria, among the cultures there, you start to get this. It's not quite writing, because the archaeologists can't find like a discernible pattern in the symbols. They're a bit random. But you look at it and it's pretty similar to like a Sumerian tablet or something like that,
Yeah.
It's got that same kind of vibe.
It's like a pseudo-pictorial representation of something. You probably maybe have to talk people through it enough so that they could get what the symbols refer to, but then they just have to refer to the chart. Oh yeah, it's this one and this, and that's that and that. They've already got sufficient language developed to be able to, encode it pictorially, I guess. We just don't have any kind of key because they don't have consistent letters or anything like that.
Yeah. So this is just an example of the kind of art that you would get with the Cucuteni Tripilia culture. Um, as you can see, the stuff on the left is quite similar to in a way to what you would get in Ice
Yeah,
Age Europe. Just like
in a way, it's also fucking weird to me. I find this stuff
yeah, yeah,
very strange.
yeah. But it's also even got like a bit of that Greco-Roman sort of look going on, like with the pottery and so on.
Definitely, yeah.
Um,
But that part in particular, I don't know if that's a reconstruction or if they've actually managed to stitch that together. But that always struck me as being hands down. If it's not the direct precursor to Greco-Roman style stuff, but it is definitely. You can see the kind of we're well on the in terms of the development of that style in about what 4,000 years or something.
mhm.
Yeah.
So now here's something that's somewhat interesting to um, further west. So that's mainly talking about the in this sort of area here. So like the Balkans. You do get megaliths. It seems like just right in the very corner of the Balkans, but most megaliths are found in this area, the sort of Atlantic, North Sea, and North Africa for some reason. And the EEFs in this part of Europe, they were pretty. They were a little bit different from the ones further east. Like for some reason, there's this phenomenon where they tended to be descended on their paternal line from the hunter-gatherers rather than the farmers, which suggests that the farmer women, like, they had a preference for men that were descended from hunter-gatherers for some reason.
Some reason.
But they tended to build stuff like this. So you've got like chambered tombs, stone circles like Stonehenge, and a lot of these were aligned to astronomy. So like especially the solstices. You've got like Newgrange in Ireland as well. And it's important to note that the British hunter gatherers they built like calendar monuments. So like we have places. There's one up in Aberdeenshire where they were putting pits into the ground to mark specific points from which to look at the stars, or like the solstices and things like that. So
And these are hunter gatherers. These are not agricultural sedentary farmers yet.
So it shows. I mean, I tend to associate astronomy and astrology, like that whole kind of star thing, more with Atlantean type people, rather than Hyperboreans. I'm not sure why.
I know what you mean. Well, it ties in with civilization, agriculture, and sedentism for one, but obviously hunter-gatherers also use the stars. And one thing I was thinking about as well was navigation by sea, especially if you're out in the middle of nowhere and if it's maybe a bit misty, you can't see any landmarks whatsoever. The only thing that you can navigate by is the stars.
Yeah.
So it really, in terms of knowledge of the stars, is about knowing where and when you are. With the Hyperborean stuff, do they really need that as much? I mean, they're here, right? And the stuff that they need is here, and the ways to use it are all sort of right in front of you in a certain way. I mean, I don't know, maybe we'll have to go a little bit more into what the kind of character differences are between Hyperborean and Atlantean. But I don't know, it kind of strikes me that if they're a little bit more immediate on the ground further to the east, that they're not going to need to read the stars as much. I still think that they would have had their understanding of astronomy and astrology, because some of those features end up in like Proto-Indo-European stuff as far as we've reconstructed it, which kind of suggests that it was there beforehand, unless they just ripped all of that off of settled people. I somehow don't think so. If hunter-gatherers are doing, like digging pits in order to be able to check the solstices or whatever, without having any kind of need to follow seasons necessarily or anything like that, then it stands to reason, as far as I'm concerned, that Eastern hunter-gatherers way off in, Eastern Ukraine or parts of Russia or whatever would have had the same kinds of understandings going on, even if they didn't express them in the same ways.
Yeah. So that's pretty much it. It's like it's all like hunter gatherers, but they do seem to have different uh, they seem to have different behavior, and a
Mm.
lot of it seems to be to do with where they live. But it's also genetic in some aspect as well, because of course the hunter gatherers living in the Western Europe, they still had that Magdalenian ancestry
Yeah,
to some extent, especially in
yeah.
Iberia, southern France kind of area. So, and again, it's like these are more sort of these are people that would have they had like the least contact, I suppose, with the ones further east, you know. And that's, I suppose, an
Mm.
important point to make, is that their contact, their frame of reference, is from this point on tending to be with these people coming up from the south, the Neolithic farmers.
Hmm.
So obviously, like in this way, like the genetics of the people that built Stonehenge and all the chamber tombs and stuff like that, it was still more like the farmers, from the Middle East, very much more
Mm.
like Southern European. So like
Hmm.
Sardinians,
Hmm.
they're the most like the early European farmers in terms of their genetics. It's that kind of genetic profile that we're dealing with, even when it comes to these people that have mostly local hunter gatherer ancestry, especially on their father's sides.
Mm.
There was another group of people that came in as the Neolithic farmers were moving into Europe from Anatolia. This group seems to have come in from Siberia. Uh, well, I mean, the comb ceramic culture itself, genetically, it is local. So, like the area on the map, that's it's the people that are the Eastern Hunter or just the people that were there before during like the Epic Revettian or whatever. It's just the
Hmm.
local
Hmm.
people, but there's an input from Siberia, and this is
Mm.
reflected in. I'll go back a few slides actually to show haplogroup NO.
Mm.
Point out how in Finland, so Northeast Europe generally, this East Asian lineage is common, and it's in this period, the comb ceramic, that it's brought by these. We're basically Chinese hunter gatherers, but they
Mm.
have pottery. Um, so and this guy Gutom guessing, like he made the point that there's like a similarity in like cultural expression, um, even with the Magdalenians in Western Europe, that
Mm.
he made connections with the Eskimo Inuit kind of people, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
So all of the north, basically, you can
yeah,
draw a ring around the whole world, and anybody who lives north of a particular point, there's some synergy in terms of their pottery at the very least, and I think some other things as well.
yeah. I mean, I'm pointing out obviously the Magdalenians didn't have pottery. He was, I suppose, talking
No,
about their tools and things like that. But yeah,
yeah.
no, this
Is that whole? Hang on, just what's the whole thing about? Bloody hell, what are they called? Who come from Europe and supposedly populated Solutreans?
huh?
How did they relate to Magdalenians again?
Oh, Sultrians. Sultrians were
Yeah.
kind of that's the periods before like, so it's in between Gravettian and Magdalenian, basically,
Right. Okay.
in
Yeah.
Western Europe. So the Magdalenians were descended from the Sultrians. So
Gotcha.
the
Okay.
Sultrians and Epigravettians, they're like the two groups that start to diverge,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
the Magdalenians descend from the Sultrians. So
Right. Because that was the argument before, was that based on the similarities in the tools, I think they were saying the Native Americans had to be descended from Europeans that crossed an ice bridge over the
mm,
Atlantic,
yeah.
which, logistically speaking, looks like an absolute fucking nightmare.
Uh,
Hope you've packed enough mammoth for that, you know.
So yeah, so this is just to show like all of the different there's a consistent pattern of migration coming into Europe from the south and then up from the east, and it seems pretty clear. Like the haplogroup N, which is carried, this is the most common Finnish haplogroup. It is most common among people that speak those type of languages. They're part of the Uralic family, and so it does stand to reason that like this language group should be associated with these people, you know. But of course, the other group that contributed much more in terms of their language were the Indo-Europeans, or Western Steppe. Indo-European is a cultural term. Western Steppe Herder is a genetic term. And so, basically, in the north, you have these Chinese or Siberian hunter-gatherers coming in and mixing with the locals, but they're still doing like the hunter-gatherer thing. They just have pottery now. This is a bit different because what happened in the Caucasus, so you've got like people doing agriculture in the Middle East. They also domesticated the animals. But in the Caucasus, the people there seem to have decided, well, they did grow crops, but for the most part, they were like, actually, we're just going to focus on herding animals because the Caucasus, I mean, it's mountains, basically.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's...
great for goats, not as good for crops.
Yeah, pretty much. Oh, shit. Just slight glitch there. Yeah, and because there are Eastern hunter-gatherers living on the steppe, the Eastern hunter-gatherers, they pick up this from the people in the Caucasus. That is just like, oh yeah, just herd cattle about. I think they grew a bit of amaranth.
Yeah.
But they're much like, they have a meat-based diet, basically, the steppe herders. And they're burying their dead in kurgans, so like burial mounds. They have these stelae here, as they're called. So these big stone monoliths, idols, as it were. And yeah, they're very different to the early European farmers. Don't get me wrong, from what we can tell, the farmers were patriarchal, it seems.
Yeah.
And so were the steppe herders. But
well, I mean, we've had discussions about this before. I mean, maybe in terms of their externalized political and social activity, yeah, like most cultures end up seeming patriarchal because they get involved in things like warfare, which people tend to delegate to men. But I think we've discussed before that there's all sorts of room to allow for, female maternal power in various levels, whether it's, in the home or in religion or, and obviously different in different cultures. So I'm just pointing that out just to say, because some people make this big point about, oh, the Indo-Europeans are patriarchal and the old Europeans were matriarchal, and it's just bollocks. People are people. And people usually have bits of both going on in different areas. And, you can say maybe one is a bit more one side than the other, but to say that they're wholesale this, that, or anything else, I think is a bit wrong, especially when you're talking the time scales that we've got involved. These things probably have fluctuated over generations, never mind centuries.
Yeah. Overall, though, like there's a pretty strong emphasis on warriors. Among
definitely.
the Indo-Europeans, like they do seem much more ostensibly martial than the.
So some of the early European farmers have got bits of that going on. Like in Sweden, they've got those burials, sort of weapon burials, with men who've seemingly spent large portions of their lives training how to use weapons. So similar kind of thing, but again, like a different expression. They don't have big, massive kurgans built around them. There's not so much of a culture of celebrating this sort of, deceased hero or whatever.
Yeah. So, another point to make as well is like these guys are not sedentary. They are roaming about,
Yeah.
and they domesticated the horse.
Yeah.
Um, and
Or if not them, they did it better. Something like that.
yeah, no, they
Yeah.
definitely did domesticate it because the
Well,
horses.
actually, in terms of what we've got nowadays, yeah, 100%. These guys, when they started off out on the steppe, would have been the ancestors of the people who gave us the modern domesticated horse, I think.
Mhm.
Is that what they worked out recently?
I think so. Yeah, it's definitely like there are other people further east that may have domesticated the horse earlier, but like are
Altai
domestic.
culture. There's people up in Altai that have got
Yeah,
horses at some point, but those are not ancestral to the horses that they now have in those regions or in like Mongolia or whatever.
yep,
Those horses they have now come from Western steppe herders. So
yep.
there you go.
So yeah, these guys move. They move east and west. I should also point out as well, like the warrior thing. That's just generally like a pastoral thing. You get that
Yeah.
in the Middle East as well. Like the pastoralists there, they also tended to be more sort of warriors, as
Isn't that the
opposed.
same in Africa?
Yeah, yep, yeah. There's definitely a connection between them.
Yeah.
The exception is in Japan, where the samurai were not so much associated with pastoralism specifically.
It's
There's
a very grain-based culture, that isn't it?
yeah, but there's a more specific, I suppose, pattern that you would associate with honor cultures. It tends to be pastoralism, but it's more like people who are living in areas that are pretty dangerous. So, for example, in Japan, the samurai came about because they were living on. They had like their grain-based sort of culture. The what do you call them? The Yamato people. Like that's
Yeah,
the name.
yeah.
And they were on the frontier with the Amishi, or the hunter-gatherers living up in the north. And yeah, it was that quite sort of dangerous environment where like he kind of lawless, and that's what it was like in the steppe. You know, when people are just their wealth is mobile, so it's measured in cattle basically, and yeah, there's no centralized authority or anything like that. You need to look out for yourself and your family, and
If there's any centralized authority, it's kind of everybody's agreed that this is the baddest motherfucker in the area and nobody mess with him.
yeah,
And if he takes issue with you, you're probably fucked and you better sort it out.
yeah, it's gangland basically.
Yeah, I
So
was going to say cowboys. It's literally
yep,
cowboys. It's cow rustling,
yep,
and it's and that's the Indo-European thing, it seems.
yep. So that's what we're dealing with here. That's the sort of thing, and these guys are moving into Europe, and the reason specifically why they are replacing a lot of the European farmers. The European farmers, they were decimated by plague. There's a study came out recently has found like that's basically what happened.
Was that also Sweden? They
Yeah,
looked at, and it was they because it used to be the idea, the Gimbutas idea was that this beautiful matriarchal old Europe got kind of summarily undone by a bunch of axe wielding maniacal patriarchal steppe pastoralists, blood and fire and all that. And then the reality seems to be that no, the old cultures sort of grew and diminished and grew again and diminished again over time, fluctuations in grain availability because of fertility issues, and then eventually they had too many famines and were too sick and got wiped out by mass disease, something like that.
yep,
There's some suggestion that Yersinia pestis was involved,
yep,
which people associate with Black Death, and
yep,
because there's like a Western steppe herders and still today we've got those of us who are descended from WSH have got better resistance to Yersinia pestis, something like that.
interesting.
There's something on all that. I can't remember the details, but it suggested that like if a few people had moved from the steppe and were integrating with European farmers, they might have infected enough communities sufficiently enough with Yersinia pestis to wipe them out, and then they'd be like, "Oh my God, everybody's dead!" Right? I'll get in touch with my cousin and tell him to come over, and we'll repopulate the land because
Yeah,
this is terrible. What's happened? Very similar to, except probably with less consciousness about it. To when Europeans were going off to the Americas
Yeah.
and saying, "Oh, you poor little natives, you're cold. Let's give you some blankets."
And again, it's interesting how it's an east to west movement as well.
Yeah.
So a
The
kind of
sun, Apollo brings healing and disease.
Yep. Yep. So there we go. So that's what the Hyperboreans are bringing to Europe. They're bringing
Healing and disease.
yeah. So yeah, you get point out in particular the corded ware culture, the blue one here. This is your sort of Northern European. That's the steppe herders mixing with the comb ceramic people. These kind of the comb ceramic people. They're still basically like Eastern hunter gatherers or whatever. Like they're not. They didn't have like a Chinese genetic profile or anything, but they definitely.
But they did have those paternal lineages, so some of those dudes rocked up at some point.
Sure, although the corded ware culture is like they don't have haplogroup N or anything like that.
No,
like,
they end up they get a lot of R1A. Which have we gone into that? I don't think we've gone into that much at all. R1B versus R1A.
Yeah, I actually chose not to go into the haplogroups today.
Let's not worry about it then.
Yeah. Well,
it might confuse people.
Actually, I suppose we could just summarize it. It's basically R1B, mainly Western Europe. That's from the steppe herders. R1A, that's the comb ceramic people. So just two groups of Eastern hunter gatherers. You've got the northern,
which is not to say that the R1A in corded ware it isn't steppe herder at that point. It is because they've integrated with steppe herder culture and everything.
Yes,
but they come from a different culture originally.
Yeah, that's where it gets a little bit confusing.
This is what
Yeah. So
and if you want to go really deep on it, we'll do a 4-hour one just on R1B and R1A. Oh, fucking hell.
Oh, exciting. Right.
Oh, God.
So I want to point out the strangeness of Bellbeaker culture. But I also want to point out as well, going back a few slides, so let us look at this map of megalithic Europe, right? And then you compare it to a map of Bellbeaker Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very, very similar.
They filled in the interior of Iberia. They finally got there.
Yeah. But the Bellbeaker culture is interesting because it's like, I mean, this map shows it kind of spread out like that, but it's important to note the little like dots, because this culture actually tended not to be like, with the steppe herders, you've got this culture just kind of spreading over like a big, just like, I mean,
wherever they could ride, to be honest, they would go,
Beaker culture spread like piecemeal, like here and there sort of stuff. And its origins are pretty interesting. It really does seem to have come from Iberia. And the context in which it came. Now, the stelae, or stele, like these things. So I showed the one earlier, the steppe herder one. So the Yamnaya culture, they had stele. And then that was picked up by the farmers that were their neighbors in this, Romania, Moldova, that kind of area. And the idea spread also with horses through Europe from east to west. And so the stele spread. So by the time you've got to southern France, stele look like this. So you've got first like the details, like this man, look at it, he's got a mustache, he's got loads of like tools and weapons, is very manly. And now you have a woman, basically. So the context for the stele has totally changed. But yeah, that's basically what's coming in. And also these farmers are they're introducing copper as well. Copper seems to, like, copper smithing seems to have been invented in Serbia. So what happens as well is that there's some hunter-gatherers still living in Iberia, and uh, they mix in with the farmers, and they create this new culture associated with these pots known as bell beakers. Now, the exact origins of the pot are debated. So there is some suggestion that there's influence from these people from the Balkans. Other people have pointed out, no, they're more similar to North African kind of pottery. It could be both. It seems at the very least like there's something going on in Iberia with this the copper and the stele having been introduced, and you've got like this input from local Iberian hunter-gatherers. Seems like women specifically, because they're I looked at the Iberian Copper Age haplogroups, and the only ones that I can find that are not there in the Neolithic are maternal haplogroups. So that implies that it's this sort of increased hunter-gatherer ancestry is coming from women. So
are they predictable, like hunter-gatherer looking haplogroups?
Yeah, it's like U5.
Yeah, okay, well there you go.
Yeah, so it's the point is that the culture spreads up to Brittany, so you get stele in Brittany, and you get beaker pottery in Brittany, and then at some point, the beaker culture becomes associated with people who have they're step herders. They're from the corded ware culture.
They've got some
in the Netherlands.
They've got some early European farmer admixture by this point, because they've picked it up as they're coming in and forming corded ware. But I think culturally we would say that they were Indo-Europeans.
Yes. At this point, though, what's interesting is that so this particular type of beaker here that you get in places like Scotland, it's the pot is a beaker. So it's the pot shape itself is probably Iberian, but the decoration on it, the cording on it, is corded ware. So so that's that just shows you it's like it's
a literal merger of the two styles.
Yeah,
probably signifying culturally, consciously merging the incoming Indo-European culture with the native, whatever. Certainly what the Iberians were representing at that point. Yeah.
What then happens is there is this genetic spread. So like it's not as if like the Indo-Europeans coming in, they do continue to replace the farmers, especially in the British Isles. And there's a broad connection between these groups. They spread into Iberia, they spread into Italy, and that's your sort of the Celtic cultures seem to come out of this.
Broadly Celtic, yeah.
Yeah. And also the Italic as well. And some of the Iberian ones that, I mean, there's interesting things going on with like the Basques. So what seems to have happened there is like men who've picked up this beaker thing moved into that kind of area around the Bay of Biscay, and just got with the local farmer women and adopted their language, which is very unusual because everywhere else there's all of the evidence shows that the local languages were replaced by these Indo-Europeans coming in. So
apart from Etruscan,
yes,
some of the other Tyrrhenian tongues. So Etruscan, again, like the Basque region, more upland, maybe harder to sort of establish oneself in areas, but still you get this tendency for the paternal lineages to be very step herder beyond a certain point.
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing, of course, about the Etruscans is like, it's quite similar to the Basques, where you've got people with mostly Indo-European, paternal lineage, but they're speaking a non-Indo-European language. So it's the same kind of thing. But and
also interesting that Etruscan and Basque are so different.
Yeah.
Which kind of suggests one of them might be older than the Neolithic.
Yes. I would put my money on Basque for that one.
Me too, funnily enough, yeah.
So, so here we have something interesting going on. So, the overall how this ties into the main point. So you've got we could call Hyperboreans coming in from the steppe. They replace and sort of mix with more Atlantean people, but like culturally, it's definitely like a new culture coming in, new language and everything. With the Beaker culture, it's a bit more. They're moving pretty far west, and there's a pretty strong suggestion that there's like a stronger local element as well because of the fact that Beaker folk then moved east. So the Beaker culture in sort of Central Europe here, that came from the west, and they've looked at the genetics of those people, and they had mixed with the farmers in Western Europe and then moved westward.
Yeah. We call that backwash.
Yeah. So again, this is another part of the pattern, in the sense that you do have some movements from west to east as well. Right. So basically, skip over the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age in Europe is a period of consolidation, where you've had the steppe herders. They've moved in, I should probably talk a little bit about the Balkans because I've just completely skipped over them. But basically, going back to this original map where it's got all the arrows pointing down, to put it simply, corded ware is mainly northern and western Europe, including Italy, and that's your sort of like bit of a mix between steppe herders, like Yamnaya culture, and these comb ceramic, whereas in the Balkans and Greece and Anatolia as well, it just seems to be Yamnaya people like moving in, and then they move into these kind of places. In the late Bronze Age, there was you had these empires. So you have the Egyptians and you have the Hittites as well in Anatolia, and their empires got hammered by a group known as the Sea Peoples. And looking at the archaeology of certain types of weapons and things like that, it really looks as if the Sea Peoples were coming from Italy, Greece, and Anatolia. So they probably would have the Anatolian ones. Yeah, it was like Indo-European people. So so this map here, it obviously shows the movements from the Middle East up into Europe itself. But the initial sort of it's not so much of a movement. I guess actually they have found evidence of genetics from the Israel-Palestine kind of area, where that definitely suggest people coming in from Italy. There's one haplogroup that is like corded ware. So that's this R1b P310, which is So that's your sort of like descendants of Beaker folk ending up in.
I got a tip off maybe a week or two ago about potentially some very sort of corded ware bell beaker looking haplogroups in Egypt from a very early point. I mean, they would be before the Bronze Age collapse, but apparently something like the samples were really low coverage, so we don't know if it actually was that or not. But anyway, the idea has been floated about, at the very least, that there was trans-Mediterranean migration going back through the Bronze Age, back into maybe the Chalcolithic, I don't know.
Yeah, so that was definitely going on. So there is these movements as well, like from Europe into the Middle East. So I already mentioned about how there were some hunter-gatherers moving into Anatolia. There is this, in the late Bronze Age, associated with the collapse of the Egyptian and Hittite empires, this movement of warriors from Southern Europe. But after the Bronze Age collapse, that's also, of course, the Trojan War as well is in that kind of context. Greeks started to settle in Anatolia. And then, especially from the 8th century BC, you start to get this Middle Eastern influence on Greek art, but also Etruscan art in Italy. And this also extends up into Central Europe. You have this site here, the Heuneburg, which is basically a city, in southwest Germany. And the culture, so the culture is becoming a lot more of that kind of, what we saw in the Neolithic, like very large sedentary settlements. You start to get at this time as well, like hill forts and stuff like that are being built in Europe. And it's just overall like this kind of you've now got cities being built in Europe by Greeks and Phoenicians that were not there before. And Rome is also founded as a city like on the Greek model, At the same time, so you've got, again, coming up from the south, got all of these cultural influences like cities they're building in stone now, and bringing with them like this very trade focused kind of stuff. But you've also got these kind of people, the Cimmerians, the Scythians, coming in from the east. Now, the Indo-Europeans that went east, some of their descendants, that's like the Indo-Aryans or just the Aryans generally. These people like in India and Persia and so on. But on the steppe, you had the Cimmerians and Scythians. They were Iranian speakers, like their language was part of that Iranian family. And they were basically steppe herders that had mixed with people in Siberia, Mongolia, that kind of areas. And they also had a little bit of input from Central Asia as well, like the Gedrosian admixture. So again, it's just like with back in the later part of the Paleolithic. So in the Paleolithic, you have. Shall go back to that. Go back to that earlier slide to demonstrate my point. You have this movement of more sort of Europeans moving eastward, mixing with East Asian type people, and then their descendants moving into Europe. The difference, though, is that this is not quite as extensive. It's really just on the steppe, and they also were breeding much larger horses than they had before. And this is the beginning of what's called the steppe nomad empire. So you have the later Mongol empire. This is where this kind of thing starts, because the horse archery. They also master horse archery. So it's the
so get fucked, everyone else. That's it. You're done.
So yeah, these guys are pretty infamous. Like the ancestors of the Jews knew who they were because they came in through the Caucasus and raided the Middle East, and they raided Europe as well. They're a force to be reckoned with. But they're also like very well known. Like to the Greeks, they were kind of like the archetypal barbarian. The Scythians were. And
these guys, these were the boreal populations. These are the people who lived where the north wind came from.
Yeah.
As far as I understand, and that's why they were quite so savage, was because where they were, it was shit. Not like further north from them, where it was really warm and the Cyclopes lived for 1,000 years or whatever.
Yeah.
Before cladding themselves in flowers and jumping off mountains.
Yeah. So again, we've got a movement from the east coming in, and as also you've got your maritime trade kind of thing moving through the Mediterranean. And they're building cities now in stone, and it's starting to get like a blend of cultural influences. But at the same time, you have this aggressive, culture coming in from the east, and this just now continues as all the way up until the Mongols. It's just wave after wave of pastoral nomads from the Asian part of the steppe just flowing into Europe. It starts in the 8th century BC, and that's just a thing from this point on in history. For anybody that's ever listened to Apraxia, that's the title of this slide is a reference to. You also have the expansion of groups within Europe as well. So now, I didn't go into much detail about this, but there is apparently evidence of migration from Neolithic Scandinavia. So in the Neolithic, obviously you've got the farmers moving up into Scandinavia, and then they seem to have mixed with the hunter-gatherers there, and then some of them moved down into Germany. Now you've got the Germanic people up in Northern Europe. They're coming down into like further into the south. So you've got the Jastorf culture. So that's in red here. It would have originally been kind of the Germanic people. That's like your Nordic Bronze Age. It would have been kind of restricted to the north coast of Germany, but now they're starting to spread out. And then you get the Goths. They're coming from this little island, Gotland here, and they come over the sea and settle in northern Poland, and then they kind of spread out over towards Ukraine. But that's sort of later on than this. To start with, it's really just the Jastorf thing, and as Germanics start to spread southward from Germany. And you also have this interesting thing where there are statues of kings and queens that have had their heads cut off from the Hallstatt period in France, and the type of torque that they would have worn was very similar to like the Lady of Vix, which is a famous like Hallstatt burial. And that's basically implying that France has been doing its revolutions for a long time. That this happened in France, but this was warriors, most likely, that were kind of doing this. And you get this new culture, the Latin culture, which the artistic style is demonstrated pretty well by this shield boss from London.
Looks like nightshades.
Yeah, there's plants which can make you go a little bit crazy.
And it seems like they started getting brought in around this time, wasn't it? Coming in Hallstatt, like Hallstatt Latin. Getting some of your more noxious, not henbane. I've forgotten which one it was.
Belladonna.
Belladonna probably comes from Turkey, and so they think that the Celts spread it.
Okay, I mean, I thought they had all that stuff. Well, Belladonna's, I'm pretty sure, native to Europe, and
there's one that's not native. I can't remember which one it is. I don't think it's henbane. It could be though. I don't know.
Well, that henbane isn't native, Alex. So
henbane isn't native.
Yeah.
Okay, it's henbane then.
Well, I know, but
a lot of henbane in.
The henbane's been there since the Neolithic, though. That's the thing.
It's not henbane then. It's something else.
Well, mandrake.
There's something, I can't remember which one, but there's one of the nightshades that has got some hallucinogenic or at least psychotropic property, supposedly spread coming into the Iron Age by a bunch of Celtic speakers. So
it's probably mandrake.
It always struck me or you look at the mirrors, you look at a lot of Latin art and even Hallstatt art, and to me it does look a lot like nightshades.
Okay. Fair enough.
It's just got something about the patterns that they use, the curvature.
Yeah. So either way, the blue on the map shows this sort of olive green parts. That's your kind of earliest Latin. I think that the stuff in Czechia here would have come from further west. So like this part of like northern France, that's where the Latin culture seems to come from, and then it just spreads. Now,
I don't know quite what's going on with that map because I'm pretty sure Latin gets as far as northern Denmark and bits of Poland.
well, I mean, you've got like the southern bit of Poland there, but it's like, yeah, no, I take your point.
Yeah. I think they're just talking about like what's the main area of
Yeah.
cultural activity, whereas when you get Latin stuff in Denmark, I think it's in the context of some other things as well. So they might have traded for it, or it might just be
Yeah.
a bit of influence, but it's not because
Yeah.
they do go Yastov quickly up there.
I mean, the point is, it's like, yeah, you've got the Galatians and stuff like that as well. So these guys are. This is a proper migration. Like, there's movement from, from France, and they're moving eastward. So again, like the Beaker thing, you know, it's an eastward migration from Western Europe, and some end up in Anatolia, and they're even moving into Britain as well. We found that with genetic studies recently. They've shown that they basically moved into the southeast, but not much else. The Latin and like the Scotland and Ireland and stuff, it doesn't seem to have been brought by people moving in. Seems to have been more of a trade thing.
There's some evidence for southwest England as well.
Yes.
And like just the south in general, there's like I can't remember if it's Gaulish-like or something like that. They get more.
Yeah.
The EEF admixture changes from the Bronze Age going into the Iron
Yeah.
Age and some other stuff. Yeah, more DF27. Sorry, we're not doing haplogroups today.
So that's going on, and then now we get onto the question of the Romans, because it's relevant to Dugin's
Dugin
claim
about
the Romans. So, I mean, as far as their genetic profile goes, well, as explained earlier, you have the Beaker folk. They move into Italy, and they mix with the local Neolithic farmers, and that's what the genetic studies show. It's like, yeah, that's who the Romans were. They were inherently polyethnic from the start because you've got these three different groups. Just to, I suppose, to explain the Latins and the Sabines, they were Indo-European speaking groups, and they were both speaking what are known as Italic languages, and just different branches. And the Etruscans, as we said before, non-Indo-European speaking. So these are different cultures. They've all got like broadly similar genetics, but you also start to get so MENA is Middle Eastern, North African ancestry coming in. So as with earlier on demonstrated by the the Greeks and the Phoenicians moving across the Mediterranean, there does also seem to have just been some Anatolians, maybe it was Greeks actually, I don't know, but they've looked at Latin and Etruscan genetics, and they're finding like, yeah, there's Greek and North African kind of genes coming in, So in terms of who the Romans thought they were, they claimed that they were descended from Aeneas, who was a Trojan. So, okay, sure, I guess the Trojans would have been Indo-Europeans. It's just that the emphasis seems to be like, oh yeah, we came from Anatolia, which
just doesn't seem to be borne out genetically. I mean, they came from over the Alps.
For the most
as far
part,
as we can tell,
But at the same time, they did have Anatolian ancestry.
Yeah,
that was coming in.
It's a strange thing with like some of them probably could have been like literally Trojan fallout, like, from the Bronze Age collapse. The thing's going to shit, and they're like, right, we've got to jump ship. Let's get on a ship and sail across the waters. Right, forget Greece, can't go there. What's the next one? Italy. Right, okay, we'll land here, spread out, and I mean, those stories could have maintained themselves for hundreds of years. And then ended up winding down into, it's Virgil, isn't it? Talking about it just was the Aeneid. It could be legit, but it's hardly representative of the whole of the Roman population. Whereas I think they probably believed that it was. Well, actually, no. I think I've read somebody from the time criticizing the Aeneid, or at least the whole Aeneas story, saying like, well, we couldn't all possibly be descended from this one bloke. That's absurd. but I can't remember the details.
Yeah. Well, the point being, like, they're, as far as their like Hyperboreanness goes, that's going to come from the through the Beaker folk. You know,
Yeah.
they will have had ancient North Eurasian ancestry. You know, so
Yep.
but I mean, like, they're and of course, yeah, they did have like an Indo-European culture.
Yeah.
They
With some distinctly sort of pre-Indo-European elements making their predictable presence known.
yeah.
You know,
I
I
mean,
mean, the Matroni and all that is a big question about whether that's an OG Indo-European thing and whether that's a West Europe
yeah.
Neolithic thing.
It has to be said though. I mean, like, you look at the Romans and their, you know, what they did. I mean, like, who do they have more in common with? Do they have more in common with the other people that we would consider Hyperborean? So, like, the, you know, the Scythians, Germanic, Celtic, and all the Siberian people, or do they have more in common with the, you know, the Greeks and Phoenicians? You know, it's
Among the Greeks and Phoenicians, they're more like the Scythians, but among the Germans and the Celts, they're far more like the Greeks and the Phoenicians. To
that's
me, they seem much
yeah,
more like they are Mediterranean, and that is their cultural and economic military orientation. That's kind of how they're doing things. But the thing that makes me think of them as being more steppe herdery is the whole legions taking vast territories is a little bit like Yamnai going, fuck it, we'll ride west and oh look, there's people out, we'll dominate this or something like that, which might not even have happened for all we know. But that's the only thing that makes the Romans seem at all more in that direction than the Greeks and I guess certainly the Phoenicians won't have had much of that going on anyway. But the Greeks have had their fair bit of sort of
oh yeah,
distinct Indo-Europeanism going on. So,
yeah,
you know, they just are a little bit more locked in. I mean, you know what I mean. There's a certain kind of sense where, you know, the hillbillies up in the rest of Europe have kept some of the crazy that seems indicative of Indo-Europeanness. And there's a lot of people who probably disagree with me on that, but I think they're full of shit personally. Whereas Romans and Greeks and stuff have got some of the sort of sense and stability that to me is indicative of long time settled sedentary civilizations building in stone, Middle Eastern kind of stuff, basically.
yeah. They seem much more like that. It's just like you said, compared to the Greeks and Phoenicians, the Romans seem more Hyperborean.
Yeah.
I don't know though about the Greeks though. I mean, like, the Greeks were, I mean, so yeah, you'd say
It can
like,
depend on when you're talking. If you're talking like archaic Greece or further, like, you know, Homeric, like the Iliad and everything, there's Indo-European as fuck. But if you're then talking about, so when Rome was being very Roman and kind of pre and early imperial and doing all that expansion stuff, Greece, they were kind of farting about, weren't they? I mean, what were they really doing? Getting fucked over by the Romans.
yeah. Well, by that point, I mean, I didn't even mention Alexander the Great.
Yeah,
And that's
yeah.
well, that's another important. But I suppose I didn't
That's an
mention.
episode of its own, I think, to talk about Alexander the Great. There's
Yeah.
a lot of weird shit going on
Well,
with that.
I mean, that's an interesting point itself. Again, it's like Alexander was, well. I mean, you had the I skipped over the Persians because the Persians, they're sort of like, again, it's just another extension of this Middle Eastern sort of influence in Europe. Alexander was then the you know,
Kickback.
movement from west to east. But the result of that was then that you had, yeah, there was a massive Greek influence on Middle Eastern culture, and that's been pretty influential. But in terms of Europe, because obviously we're just focusing on Europe today, it's just bringing in more Middle Eastern influence.
Yeah, pretty much.
So,
Yeah.
so yeah, just, and I suppose they would have got that. The Greeks would have got that from the Alexander's conquest, but of course the Romans. Maybe these little details are important. So, for example, you know, the Greeks are moving into. So to start with, you get Greeks. They've got Yamnaya Indo-European descent. So like Yamnaya guys that or steppe herd or whatever, they move into Greece, mix with the locals, It's still pretty Indo-European. Like Bronze Age Greek culture seems pretty Indo-European. They fight with the Trojans. They move into Anatolia, and then they mix with the Anatolians there, and that is part of the Middle Eastern influence through the Mediterranean that the Greeks are bringing. And then we have the Persians. They are they took over like bits of Europe, but they didn't really like that. I don't think their impact in Europe was very substantial. But then obviously Alexander invades, and then you get this further Middle Eastern influence coming in. The Romans would have only received that like first wave from the Greeks and Phoenician, or mainly the Greeks.
They would have got peripheral stuff from Alexander's conquests because of trade, but it's not going to be a direct. They didn't have, probably quite significant quantities of people moving over into Italy, as was happening in the Bronze Age collapse. So, yeah, different.
Yeah. So again, it's like that's maybe why we'll find this pattern as we move through, that this is I suppose how one can potentially interpret the Romans as Hyperborean is by comparison. It's like, well, they're more Hyperborean than the Carthaginians, like,
yeah, sure.
But are they more who are they more similar
Romans,
to?
The Romans are more Hyperborean than the Indians. The Romans are more Hyperborean than like Andean villages of 1,000 years subsequent to them. Like, it becomes a bit absurd, doesn't it?
I wonder about that, Alex. I wonder if some of these, like, because I didn't mention this, but the ancient North Eurasian group, like, the people the most like them are people living in the Andes, So,
yeah. Okay. Wow. I picked the right fucking one then, didn't I? Holy shit.
So they may be more Indo-European than the Romans. Who knows?
There you go. If you're a real Indo-European fan and you want to really get in on that, go to the Andes and learn about all that lot.
So, this is not a completely introductory presentation. I am assuming that our audience has a basic familiarity with the fact that this is the Roman. Yes, the Romans, they spread out and they conquered a bunch of shit. I
couldn't hold it because they're a bunch of wankers. What?
Sorry, I've just noticed, Alex, looking at this map. Why is Scotland included in the Roman Empire? Because that was, oh god.
Yeah, because fuck it, who needs to be accurate? It's just a fucking map. It's Roman propaganda, my friend. Accuracy? What? Being honest about things? Bullshit. No, fudge it all.
Anyway, so I came, I saw, I conquered. Basically, the Celts are a bit kind of like. So initially they're all over Western Europe, Central Europe and stuff, and but now the Romans, you've got the Germanic tribes coming in from the north, and the Romans coming up from the south, and they just squeeze out the Celts, and the Celts are kind of in Scotland.
Yeah, pick
and Ireland.
one or the other, or you'll have your choice made for you, basically.
Also, all of the people living in the Balkans, people I didn't even mention, descended from Yamnaya, so like the Thracians, the Illyrians, Pannonians, like they're now all kind of being Greco-Romanized and all that. Their cultures.
Have we had any Avars turning up yet, or is that a subsequent thing?
And that's a bit later than this.
Is there anything prior to Avars that's basically Avars but earlier than that?
Huns.
Huns are earlier than Avars.
Yeah.
No, but there's some like pseudo Avars that are earlier than Huns, or am I getting this the wrong way around again?
Are you thinking of the Yazyges?
Maybe I'm thinking of the Yazyges. I thought the Yazyges were a kind of Goth. This is the thing where it's getting very, very complicated on the step at this point.
Okay.
Oof.
Try to simplify it. Basically, the Romans. You've got this map here. That's it. Once it's been divided up, but it was more unified before that. They expanded as much as they could. They reached their limits in the southeast. It's like they couldn't conquer the Persians. This map is after they abandoned Dacia here in Romania. They actually did get that sort of area in Romania there. But where it says
south, at least,
where it says Ostrogoths, earlier than that, that's where you had like the Scythians were in and around there. You had another related people called the Sarmatians, and the Romans. The Sarmatians became more important than the Scythians, but they were like a Scythian tribe. It was just another steppe nomad people. The Romans could never conquer the Sarmatians. The Yazyges lived in this little area here. So, like, you've got the Carpathian Mountains all around, and the Yazyges are living in this steppe part in what's now the eastern part of Hungary. They were a branch of the Sarmatians. So the Romans, any Sarmatian people, the Romans couldn't conquer, and they couldn't conquer the Germanic people either. And they just, I think they just didn't bother with the people living in Scotland and Ireland. Like, they had a go at Scotland a few times, but there's just
had it handed to them.
Yeah.
Too wet, too cold, too misty. Horrible barbarians living in the swamps.
I think maybe the difference is like they kind of just couldn't be bothered. I mean,
to be fair, there's not a whole lot to take in Scotland.
Yeah, but yeah. So point being is that the empire expanded, and now they've got a bunch of these tribes on their borders. And by this kind of period, the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, those tribes are then starting to move it, like inundate and
boil over a little bit. Yeah.
So again,
because some of them are getting pressured from tribes further beyond them, who are then pushing them into Roman territory, and there's a lot of oh, can we come settle on your side of the river? Oh, yes, thanks very much. Oh, no, now you're persecuting us. Right, we're going to go fight you then. Oh, no, we're going to get our friends from over there to come and help us. And then, a lot of interesting episodes between Rome and the barbarians on the borders.
Yeah. So that's point being, I suppose, is that the Roman Empire, the spread of the Roman Empire, you're having like, and again, this is why this is like, I can't agree with Dugan on this. It's like the Romans are bringing like the Atlantean influence. Like there wasn't cities before in a lot of these areas. They built cities. They civilized the people there, and everything became much more how one would imagine Atlantis to be. Is like we associate the Romans with decadence and all of that kind of stuff.
Rome has its fair bit of hubris, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, we'll take it. We'll take the whole world. Oh fuck, we've overextended ourselves. Like anybody who probably knew some of the history of the Bronze Age collapse, for example, might have thought that could be a bad idea. Or even people who knew some of the ins and outs of Alexander's empire might have thought this could be a bad idea. But history was maybe a bit lost on some of these people.
So now we have. Barbarians at the gates. They're coming in, and they're even so influential. You have people like the Franks. They're settled in what's now Netherlands, Belgium kind of area, and the fashion changes. So like now the Romans are starting to look a lot more like barbarians.
Some proper trousers on instead of walking around in a bloody dress.
Yep. The empire is also fracturing. It's basically split between. I know there's like 4 sections on it, but it's basically now split between east and west. And then you get again more tribes from the east, only now with more East Asian admixture.
It's come back again. It's come back again and again and again.
So again,
it's that immolation trap.
Okay. More of these tribes, and now they're pushing, Germanic tribes like the Goths into the empire. And like you just said, it's like, can we settle on your side of the river? These guys are giving us hassle. And it's they're starting. This is now the next wave of like the sort of Hyperborean movement of barbarians coming into the empire, and they're starting to cause real problems. The Goths even kill the Roman emperor. They're sacking Rome, and they're carving up the empire among themselves. So the Vandals are interesting because they seem to have originally came from Scandinavia. I suppose like most of the Germanic people or whatever but they ended up just sort of moving through Europe and trying to get into Gaul. The Romans didn't like them being there, so they actually got the Visigoths. So it's funny because the Visigoths sack Rome, and then the Romans are like, "Hey, can you help us like sort out these?"
Can you get the Vandals out too while you're at it?
Fucking hell, man.
So yeah, then they give them Aquitaine in southwest France so that they kick out the Vandals. The Vandals move into Iberia. The Goths just then take over Iberia, and then the Vandals end up in North Africa. So the Romans are just consistently losing now through their...
Because they keep inviting these barbarians in.
Yeah.
Can you help us with that? Thanks for helping, but now you've taken that territory, right? Well, okay. I guess we'll just have to get more barbarians in.
But now at this stage, like
it's weirdly familiar, isn't it? There's something strikingly similar to some other period of time. I can't quite remember which it is.
Yeah. To be fair, the Romans do this policy actually does mean that the Romans defeat the Huns. So
to be fair,
at
least technically they defeat the Huns. I mean, I think I said in one of the previous ones that, as far as I'm concerned, the Huns fucking won that. There's no expectation that they should have done as much as they did, and they fucking changed the whole face of Europe for the next 600-700 years.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, they lost the battle, but they won the war, kind of thing.
Pretty much, they lost on a technicality. Their leader died, and they happened to be the kind of polity that wouldn't really survive. No,
I mean, like they did lose. They lost the Battle of Chalon. In what was that? There was I don't remember the date for that. It's in the
400.
Yeah, 450 sounds about right. But the point is that the Romans only won that because they had the Visigoths and the Franks on their side.
Yeah.
So that policy.
And I mean, if you look at then fast forward 100 years, it's Frankish territory. So
yeah, pretty much. That's just what happens is that the barbarians just take over.
And I just want to make a quick point that Middle Francia, I think, was when the Frankish Empire split. What was it called again? Lotharingia. Is that right?
Lotharingia, yeah.
Right, Llother. That's a Hunnish name. That's Hunnic or whatever language it was. Okay. I can't remember. That's from that. So there's some interesting stuff going on there about who is Lothar or Lothair. That's a Hun's name. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I mean, the guy that it's named after, he was like a later Frankish king, but
he's clearly still got there's some connection going on to Attila and all that, clearly, in terms of how they're thinking about things.
Attila features pretty heavily in Norse poetry.
Atli. Yep. I love that. Atli, like little dad, isn't it? You're right, little dad. Fucking great.
There's definitely something about the Huns, like the impacts that they had on the Germanic psyche. It was pretty massive. Just to demonstrate as well, like genetically speaking. So I mentioned a few of these more sort of obscure peoples in the Balkans, the Thracians, the Illyrians, and so on. And they, over the course of this period, they just got replaced by Slavs. Their descendants seem to be the Albanians, and also, well, the Romanians. We'll not get into the Balkan stuff, but basically, like there was pretty extensive replacement of populations in the Balkans, and also in large parts of England as well. So the Anglo-Saxon invasion was definitely a thing. Like they came in and they did it wasn't a wholesale just.
It's not Bede's genocide or Gildas or Nennius or whichever one it is, but it is a pretty hefty. I would call it a population supplementation with an understanding that the post-Roman collapse population was necessarily smaller, than the imperial the heights of the empire had been.
Yeah. Well, the point
So
is,
yeah,
though, the Anglo-Saxon migration. I mean, it was the biggest thing in Britain since.
well, the Romans.
No, not really the Romans, because that wasn't actually that many people moving in.
Oh, you mean in terms of like genetic
Yeah,
kind of
just
placement?
the
Yeah,
Beaker period, the
pretty much.
Indo-Europeans
Yeah.
moving in. So, in a lot of the other places, I mean, you had definitely movements of people. Lombards into Italy were like another wave that came in, and they've left a decent impact on the Italian genes, So, but the point is that it's like now you've got this. It's basically the Indo-European migrations all over again. Let's face it. Like that's what's happened here. It's like the Roman Empire is like the Neolithic farmers and all of these barbarians. It's the Indo-Europeans, and it's like there's a gradient from north to south, in the sense of like what become the Romance cultures in Iberia, Italy, France, and so on. They're less. They're more like the sort of local cultures that were there already. Again, similar to in the Bronze Age and so on. It's like, because just the direction that the groups are coming from, they obviously would lose steam as they move further southwest. So it's just part of the pattern. Now, the other thing that happens that's hugely important in this period is the conversion of these barbarians to Christianity. Didn't mention it. It's like, oh yeah, by the way, the Romans are mostly Christian at this point. That's the thing. But of course, Christianity, I mean, you could consider that an Atlantean thing. It comes from the Middle East. So, and you have the emergence of like the Catholic and Orthodox churches, which basically reflects the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. So all of the Germanic and Slavic tribes settling in the empire, they're being, the former empire, they're being converted to Christianity, and you have this new religion and so on. So like the empire is gone, but the institution and like the Latin language and so on, like that's persisting through the church. And it's then influenced.
That's been our theory, basically, is that the Catholic Church represents the maintenance of a centralized Roman power in the absence of a kind of political establishment. They're like, okay, right, the empire's not working anymore. We're not going to be able to do this as a consolidated nation state. Let's do it as a religion then. And they're like, oh, okay, yeah, we'll take all these means, great, sploosh together, right, it's Christianity, get everybody, make them Christian, okay, we've only got 100 years left, oh, look, barbarians are here, shit, right, everybody Christian, quick, barbarians, you want to be Christians too? Yes, no, yes. And then eventually it's like, well, yeah, I suppose the Orthodox Catholic split is the bit that they weren't betting on.
Sure, yeah. The other thing that happens as well at this time is the Moors invade, and they're interesting because until this point there's not really been that much. There's been influence coming from North Africa into Iberia, but really not that much. Whereas at this stage it's like it's a decent amount of people coming in. It's still not replacement migration as from Anatolia or the steppe and stuff like that. But yeah, it's its own thing that just kind of happens, and that becomes a thing throughout the Middle Ages. It wasn't so much a thing before. But again, it's a Middle Eastern religion, Middle Eastern North African people. So again, it's like this Christianity and Islam, to me, they represent like the Atlantean movement. So once you have all of the barbarians coming in from the north and the east, now through religion, so not so much migration, a little bit from the Moors, but now it's like a cultural thing mainly, and it's now influencing the now sort of consolidating Europe, which is dominated now by Germanic cultures in the west and Slavic cultures in the east. Oh yeah, I just wanted to point out as well, of course, like the similarity in the architecture, like it's all like the Greco-Roman kind of stuff. I mean, the Islamic civilization is heavily influenced by Greco-Roman civilization, simply because that's what the Arabs took over, you know. So that's why I would argue it's like, yeah, it is all part of the same kind of thing. You could consider Atlantean, you know, columns and shit. And yeah, you have again now more. This is not so much a migration, but like there's well, almost like the Roman campaigns against the Germans. You've got the Franks attacking the Saxons, and now it's taking on an ostensibly religious aspect with Charlemagne. And you know, he's even crowned Holy Roman Emperor. So again, it's just emphasizing the way in which like this is the barbarians now being you know, Romanized, or like you know, so you have this Hyperborean thing. Now the Atlantean influence is coming up, and now it's pushing. But then again, there is a reaction to that, or maybe it wasn't actually like a reaction to that happening, but it's like another pulse from Hyperborea. So you've got the Vikings from Scandinavia. They're spreading out and pummeling you know, British Isles and France. And you also have the Magyars as well. Sorry, Alex, I completely skipped over the Avars. But the Avars were
don't worry, it's fine.
Yeah, the Avars are basically another sort of more East Asian steppe group. They came between the Huns and the Magyars. And the Magyars are basically the reason why the Hungarians don't speak an Indo-European language. And again, what's interesting about it is that the Magyars. This is kind of the case with the Viking Scandinavians as well. These migrations are not quite so extensive. Like this isn't so much like replacement migration kind of thing in the 9th and 10th centuries. This is more.
These are much more like elite groups. So with the possible exception of the Danelaw, it might be the only one where you have seemingly a sizable number of farmers coming over. But
even then, it really doesn't seem as if the settlement.
It's not the same as the Anglo-Saxons at all.
No,
because that's a huge body of people moving over time. Whereas Vikings is just it's war bands. It's war bands and their followers, and that is between 50 to a couple thousand people. I don't know. It's not very many really.
Yeah. So I suppose the point at this stage is that in terms of like really big migrations, genetics, and all that kind of stuff, the migration era that's happened before this, that's now kind of ended, and we haven't seen such extensive migration in Europe until now, quite recently. So yeah. But there's still people coming in. Like there's still influences now coming into Europe. From Scandinavia and from the Magyars. But after that point, again, it's more of like a consolidation period. These groups...
Internal rejigging.
Yeah. These groups are converted to Catholicism. And then you have the call for the Crusades. Which, again, it is important to note that there's like the give and take when it comes to Catholicism in particular. Because as the Germanic tribes are being converted to this Roman religion, they are also influencing the people in Southern Europe, and the knightly culture is definitely a Germanic thing. The emphasis on horses as well, even that's gives you some sort of steppe influence. So like despite Christianity, like there's still a strong Hyperborean influence on medieval European culture. It
comes from the Germanic elites, I guess.
Yeah, but again, like so we've had before with the Sea Peoples. So Europeans going and attacking the Middle East. It's happening again, in the Crusades. But the Crusades are important because at this stage, that you have, by the time you get the Fourth Crusade, you've got now Catholics attacking, the Greeks in Constantinople,
Yeah.
now Istanbul, and they've kind of lost the plot when it comes to, the fighting against the Muslims, and now it is just raiding, and they raid Christians.
The old habits die hard, man.
Yeah.
Where are the cattle?
And so now, but the interesting thing about the Fourth Crusade is that this is actually part of what then starts to bring more of the Greco-Roman influence into Western Europe, because you get all of this stuff being looted. So like the horses of St. Mark, which they're ancient things, but they were looted by Phoenicians and taken to Venice. I suppose, actually, to be honest, the real point at which this kind of influence came in was because that was when Constantinople got taken by the Turks. So. But that's a little bit later on. So yeah, the context for Catholic Europe is the Crusades. So there's this military kind of expeditions to the Middle East, and there's definitely some influence coming from the Middle East into Europe. Like there's evidence that certain like games and musical instruments and stuff like that been influenced by the Arabs and so on. But you also have another movement of steppe peoples, and this one is pretty terrifying for the Rus in particular, because they come in and they completely wreck the place, and they the stories about nuns being raped on altars and all this kind of stuff when they attack Kiev. This is basically like it's like the Huns again, basically. Only for, these...
It's like the Huns again. That's just a thing that you could say.
Yeah.
You're having a bad day. Oh, it's like the Huns again.
Yep. So now, like, you have, these, the Slavs, they've kind of just been doing their own thing. Like, they've obviously, the Rus itself was founded as a result of Swedes coming in and settling in what's now Russia, and that's right. I'm sorry, I can't take it anymore. I really need to go to the toilet.
Oh shit!
Need to take a break.
Do I have to entertain people for however many minutes?
Oh man, yeah.
Wow. Well, now I don't know what kind of thing I could possibly talk about while Connor's gone. Tatar yokes, the Principality of Moscow. I mean, fuck Moscow. Everybody knows that that's a whole crock of shit, right? I mean, the Muscovites and taking over Siberia, whenever that was shite. I hate that. Mongols were cool, though, apart from the whole raping nuns on altars thing. That's not cool. Don't do that. But in terms of, denuding large portions of land of all of their agriculture and decimating the populations of various cities and generally contributing to making sure that forests can regrow in various parts of the world where they might not have been seen for centuries or even millennia. The Mongols were actually a really good thing. They might have terrified the Rus, they might have terrified some other people in their time, but actually, all told, I think we're going to have to agree with Attila that God periodically sends his sword from the east to cleanse the west, because for some reason, decadence tends towards the west, I guess. And that's probably what Dugin's trying to go on about with his whole, we're Russia and we're Hyperborean. But he's just a fucking tool because he somehow thinks that Rome's cool. So he lumps Rome in with it when he's completely wrong. As you do.
Yep. Okay.
There you go. I think I managed to bridge that well enough. You're right there, Connor.
Yep. Okay. Right, so we may continue. We don't have a massive amount of time to go anyway, I don't think, anyways. But yeah, point being that the Principality of Moscow was founded in this context, the Tatar yoke, which is basically where the Russians are being they have to pay tribute to the Mongols and the Tatars, I suppose. Which the Tatars were like they were Turkic people already living on the steppe that just kind of got absorbed by the Mongols. So
yeah, they aren't Mongols, but they do the Mongols' dirty work or something like that.
Pretty much, yeah. They were like their bodyguards and stuff.
Yeah.
So
I've read stuff where the Mongols were terrified of the Tatars up to a certain point.
Okay.
So
interesting.
Yeah. And up until the point when Genghis fucked them up, I think, and then they weren't scared of them anymore because the Tatars were working for them.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm going to be focusing quite heavily on Russia because I can't kind of underestimate like how much the Mongol invasion impacted the Russian psyche. And this is, I think this is like really strongly influenced their
is it just the psyche that got impacted, or was there significant, and when I say significant I don't mean massive, but at least some notable genetic impact that sort of...
I did mention nuns raped on altars, but I don't think so. No, I think it was
no.
So
all the talk then about you dirty Slavs with your East Asian ancestry and all that crap that you end up hearing, bollocks.
That's literally, I'm pretty sure, just the comb ceramic thing, you know.
So that's old school. Fair enough. Because you always hear all this stuff on the forums about the dirty Mongol blood and all that, and I'm thinking the Mongols fucking killed it. They were amazing. Like, you want to have some fucking Mongol blood? Come on.
Well, either way, like, they didn't contribute much. Like I said, like the major migrations and stuff like that. This period in European history is over for the time being. But again,
but at least so then the influence that is left on Russia by the Mongols is this sort of history of having really had it handed to them.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. And it's like the Slavs, they up until this point they had not experienced anything like this. That's probably something that's worth emphasizing, or at least like these Slavs. So like the peoples in like the Romans, they had the Huns attacking them and so on, whereas like the people living in this part of Europe, it's like there's never quite the same. I don't know, like maybe the Slavs would have just been overall used to like the steppe tribes like coming and raiding and stuff.
And raiding, but this is the thing. I think by the time like the Kievan Rus had developed enough, they had obviously they were Christianized. They had a lot of influence coming from the Mediterranean through all the thoroughfares that the Varangians were taking to get down to Constantinople. So they were building things in stone, if I'm not mistaken. They were getting bigger cities developed. They were getting serious economies developed. And that meant that suddenly these portions of Slavic territories, which beforehand had largely been wooden structures, thatched roofs, horses, cattle, and perishable stuff, now they've got a lot more, strongholds and gold, probably gems and jewels, and just fine things that raiders are going to be interested in. So it's probably the scale was absolutely different from what it had been before. It had been people looking for food, right, and like some will take their herds away and stuff like that. Now it's people looking to despoil, like properly, set things on fire.
Yeah. No, and just like the mentality as well, like there was a proper ideology as well behind Genghis Khan and his like, it is my like God-given right to conquer the world, and it's like he passed on to his descendants. That's quite different from just like we're just like we just want your stuff.
Yeah, very different. Because we just want your stuff. I mean, they've noticed this thing with raiders end up being very, very good at understanding what they should take and what they should leave behind. Because you want to be able to raid in your next season. Whereas with something like the Mongol Empire, they weren't wanting to raid the next season. They wanted to own it the next season. They weren't looking to come through. They were there to stay. And that's sort of,
They had, yeah. They also, I mean, I don't really want to know, to be honest, like how the Mongols that at this time turned out the way they did, because it's just something about their like absolute determination to use like psychological warfare as well. So like just
Yeah. Didn't
absolutely,
they do that whole thing of like catapulting carcasses over the
yeah.
walls to like, yeah, fucking wow.
Look, again, the Huns. Well, the Huns were kind of similar. So there's something about Mongolia.
Something about East Asians, man.
It's a bit racist, Alex.
Oh, I know. That's why I said it.
But yeah, so either way, whatever. Well, I suppose one point that does need to be emphasized is genetically speaking, yeah, the Mongols they are the most East Asian of any group so far. Apart from maybe like that little group of like Chinese Siberians, like the Proto-Finns that came in. The Mongols.
I'm even tempted to say that they're more East Asian than that because Mongolia, haven't they got a lot of? Sorry, we're on to haplogroups again. Haven't they got a lot of Y DNA?
No, it's C2.
C2. Okay, I forget. I keep
yes.
C and D. I always get. D is Tibetans then.
Yeah, and
okay,
Japanese.
so but C1 and C2, and those are older in that area than NO, as far as I understand it.
I suppose they would be. Yeah.
If I'm right about that, then yeah, Mongolians more East Asian than the Chinese. What the fuck does that mean? I don't know, but there you go.
Well, yeah. So point being, like, racially, this group, yeah, they're the most East Asian coming in Europe, and they're also the most terrifying that have come so far. Yeah. And yeah, I suppose we need to be then honest about the fact that, as far as you've got these people coming in, genetically they're very different from the Russians, despite what people in forums might say about like Mongol blood and so on. They're like, yeah, they're very, very different, and they're coming in and they're just absolutely determined to terrorize the shit out of them. It's like that does create these I guess associations, or these there's good like evidence that a lot of people develop like racial prejudice out of experiencing having been like seriously harmed by somebody that's very genetically different, and the reason for that is simply because of the it's kind of like a biological recognition of like the difference, and then a psychological association of the I suppose like, oh, it's connecting like genetically different from what's the word? Well, just threatening, I guess.
Yeah.
So that's the thing in human psychology, I'm sure, and I'm kind of making that point that this this might have just impacted the Russian psyche.
Just a little bit,
So moving back to the West, so like I said, probably should have emphasized the Turkish conquest more. Of course, the Turks, they're coming from Anatolia. Okay, it's another Atlantean kind of thing. Ottomans, they take Constantinople. That is the point. A lot of Greeks move into Italy in particular. Again, just like in the
Transition collapse, yeah.
Yeah, after that, and it begins this Greco-Roman cultural revival, which doesn't affect Russia quite as much as the rest of Europe. Again,
until later.
Well, to be fair, actually, it does affect it to the significant degree of religion, because the Western Europe and Poland and that they're all Catholic, whereas the Greeks that flee to Moscow, they
all
declare,
Orthodox, yes.
They do.
They're all Orthodox, and they
Yep.
they meddle with the Russian Orthodox Church. They make it more like the Greek Church or something like that.
Yeah. So it's actually that bit where it says not so much Russia. Actually, no, fuck that. I would take that out. It's like, no, it's very much influenced Russia, because the Greek,
Not as evident in like the architecture until a couple of centuries later. They suddenly
Yes.
get very Greco-Roman and like
Uh-huh.
pointedly. It's weird.
Yeah. But there is definitely there's different things going on in this context. In further west, there's definitely you get the rise of the bourgeoisie, things like that, and there's definitely like more of this maritime emphasis. So yes, it is more like the Phoenicians and Carthage. You have Europeans sailing around the world, Christopher Columbus and all that kind of stuff. And
Hmm.
yeah, so it's just the Carthaginians and the Greeks. They were really just focused on the Mediterranean. Now, um, you know, most of these, I suppose, more Western Europeans are focused on just the whole
The
rest of the world.
Atlantic,
Well, not just the Atlantic, but
not just, but you know what I mean. Like there's a big picture. Well,
uh,
they're Western Europe,
yeah,
and the quickest
Atlantis.
thoroughfare for them
Yeah,
is right next door. So, here we
yeah,
go. This is Atlantis
yep,
of the present, Holocene
yeah.
period.
Um, and then you have the Russians, on the other hand, are expanding east because they start to uh, defeat the Mongols in battle
Mm,
in the 14th century, and then gradually like they start to get the upper hand
mm,
over the Tatars. A lot of it is technological. A lot of it is because they get gunpowder, so that gives them an
mm.
edge over. Well, again, as with the Europeans generally, like the gunpowder gives them a massive advantage over everyone else.
Yeah, I
So
still not quite understood that. How nobody, I mean, we didn't invent gunpowder. How did nobody else figure that you should just be able to shoot people, right? How did it take? I
well,
mean, was there something about European mentality that's just like, I could use this to kill someone?
it's I think as well. It's I mean, there's other factors as well. Like I said, the stuff to do with how European society developed technologically, and also just I think a lot of it as well has just been the chance. So, well, in the sense that like part of the reason why Europeans wanted to explore was because they wanted access to trade goods from Asia, but they didn't
Yeah,
want to have to go through the Muslims. So they tried to
yeah,
find other ways of getting those trade goods.
sneaky fuckers.
So so yeah, that's why they ended up doing the whole exploring and maritime thing, and then they found in a lot of other parts of the world, yeah, that their level of technology gave them an advantage over the natives.
Mm,
You know,
hmm, hmm.
just how it goes. And this happened um, in this area as well with the Russians. The main difference, though, of course, is that the Western empires were mostly maritime, whereas the Russian Empire was just spreading over the land. Um, and these were the sort of peoples that they encountered. So you have the Tatars. They're more like the Turkic steppe. Well, I
Mm,
suppose actually Tatarstan isn't on the steppe, but there are Tatars that live on the steppe as well.
mm,
They are traditionally Muslim, um, which I suppose I forgot to mention as well is like the Muslim the Mongols in Europe converted to Islam because the Tatars were already Muslim. That was the thing that happened as well. Which I suppose you could point that to Atlantean influence. Having moved up
yeah,
already.
yeah.
Some of these other peoples, like the Yakuts or
Hmm.
Sakha, they live like really far east, and the Chukchi. The Chukchi are just like really badass. I just included them just because I wanted to mention how the thing says peoples conquered by Russia, but the Chukchi actually weren't conquered by Russia. They were just so badass that they just um, that they were essentially the arrangement that they had with the Russians was, oh, we'll just acknowledge you. It's like, do we have to pay like the fur tax? Like, no, just acknowledge us. It's like, okay,
Yeah,
go away. Once you get into
yeah.
the Soviet period, it's a bit different. Um,
Hmm.
uh, but yeah, up until that point. But yeah, so like as far as the Hyperborean thing goes, uh, it is reflected in this map of Cold War Europe. This is, I think, around about 1952 or so, maybe a little bit later. But it's like you've got NATO to the west and the Warsaw Pact to the east. And again, it does kind of reflect, so some of those earlier maps, Neolithic Europe, the Roman Empire, the Beaker culture, like all of this kind of Western Mediterranean thing, it is pretty well reflected in like NATO membership in this map, and then of course everything else to the east is part of the Warsaw Pact. So it is interesting how definitely Dugin, his point does stand as far as the pattern goes, but at the same time, there is the issue of like, well, what exactly is Hyperborean and Atlantean? So like, again, in terms of comparison, you look at this map and you consider like these things as like the fact that America and the Western European empires are all much more maritime. Oh yeah, of course, it's more like Carthage. Of course, it's they draw more from these influences that have come from the Middle East into Europe. But the Russians were still acting very much like the Romans, who were again had Hyperborean descent, but they were also very, very influenced by things coming from the Middle East. And that's just what I mean. One thing that I did think was interesting is that so you had these movements from west to east. So the initial one, way back in the Upper Paleolithic, where the Auric nations from Europe moved into Siberia, and then they mixed with people there to form the ancient North Eurasians. And then you also have the steppe herders moving east. Like the Russians colonizing Siberia, it's still that kind of west to east movement of people, genetically European people, moving into Siberia. Only the Russian colonization was just like they didn't really mix with the locals so much. So they've just kind of replaced them in a lot of places. So otherwise, though, colonial empire, they, especially like during Stalin's time, like they were trying to make a lot of the native peoples that had been conquered by Russia in earlier times, more Russian. And there's also a lot of this emphasis on the Orthodox Christian heritage. You get, I mean, Putin and a lot of like Russian nationalists, they emphasize that, and it's like Third Rome kind of stuff. And it's all of this stuff to do with like, okay, we've basically shown how Rome and Christianity, the Romans, they did have Hyperborean going on to some extent through, well, that's the Indo-European thing. That's pretty much the only way in which the Romans were Hyperborean, is that they were descended from Indo-Europeans. Apart from that, everything else about Rome, and I suppose the influence that Greece and Rome had on Russia, is all like Atlantean stuff coming in, The Slavs, obviously, like they obviously count as the Hyperborean thing, but it's like, I suppose you could say this Rome and Russia being Hyperborean thing, it's kind of like, well, are they Hyperborean or are they Atlanteanized Hyperboreans, or
are they Hyper-Atlantean?
Or are they even better? Yeah. So again, in terms of degree, it's like you look at Russia and versus the West. It's like, oh yeah, well obviously Russia is the more Hyperborean one.
It's literally further north than most of Western Europe, so yes.
But
at the same time, culturally, I mean,
well, that's I suppose we can maybe get more into that in future presentations as to like what exactly like that. This presentation's mainly just been sort of going over broad, just the whole European history. I've obviously skipped out massive chunks just to make this sort of more superficial point about the Hyperborea and Atlantis dichotomy. But we can get more deep into like what we think that how these terms actually reflect, expressions by different groups of people. So, I mean, it is still all dependent from perspective. So, from Dugan's perspective, he's looking at things in terms of the patterns and the comparisons between different groups, and it's like, oh well, we can see definitely there's but Rome and Carthage, that's a lot like Russia and the West, and it's like, well, what Russia? Well, there's this connection to Asia because obviously Siberia is part of Russia, and there is this connection going back with these more Europeans with more East Asian influence to the east, and then Europeans with more like Middle Eastern and North African influence to the south and west. But it's in terms of like how this actually expresses itself in terms of culture and politics and like modern society and so on. I think it's pretty like it's pretty hard to make the case that like modern Russia is more comparable to a lot of the indigenous Siberians, the ancient Slavs and stuff like that, than it is to the West, like today. And
the very fact that he says Russia and Rome and puts those two together proves categorically how Western modern Russia is.
Yeah.
It's that simple. It's just if you want a blueprint for how Europe was going to develop through feudalism and on into modernity, well, look at Greece and Rome, and look, that's exactly what happened to Russia. So, I mean, really, this is why I said twat right at the beginning, because it's like, it's not even like the least level of thought has been put into that. It's like some kind of anti-thought has been put into that to turn around and say, actually, Russia's more like Rome and the West is more like Carthage. What the fuck is he smoking? This is so weird. It's just such an odd thing to say.
Well, again, I've shown how it's like there's definitely something to it. There is a logic.
Sure, but it's just that Rome and Carthage are so much more like each other than either of them is like two fucking Tuvans or I don't know Kipchaks or whoever the hell else that Russia has totally bulldozed over the past 200 years.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? Like there are actual Hyperborean communities still in existence in Russia that are trying to subsist according to traditional modes, right? That's Hyperborean. What Russia as a nation state represents is the Atlantean influence on northern Eurasia.
Yeah.
It's just so fucking farcical.
Yeah. So it's interesting as well just how it seems as if at this point, there's been persistent kind of to and fro between these things, but it really does seem as if the Atlantean influence has come to dominate. It wasn't always like that. I suppose there was periods where I suppose you could say the Hyperborean thing dominant. So for example, back all the way in which it's like there were only very briefly like East Asian people living in Europe. Like the people, so the Europeans had an East Asian genetic profile, like way at the start, and then I suppose some of these other periods where like you've had the I don't know, like Bronze Age Europe, medieval Europe. There's still there's like the migrations by the Indo-Europeans and then the barbarians later on, like that's taken over Europe. I guess that those periods, the Bronze Age and uh, the Middle Ages, they're probably the closest you would get to like more Hyperborean domination in Europe and northern Eurasia, that kind of thing. But at this stage, yeah, like you say, Russia is like the Atlantean, like the Russian Federation, the state is like the Atlantean
specifically
force.
the state, because Russian individuals can be extremely Hyperborean in their character or their spirituality, the same as Scandinavian individuals, British and Irish individuals, pretty much anybody from Europe. I mean, those tendencies still do come through, whether people are Christian or not, or whatever, country or language they speak or anything. You do get evidence of that heritage coming through people. It's just that I think you're right. Over time, especially on the nation-state level, the Atlantean tendencies have exerted themselves more fully and more completely, and it's throttling, I would say.
Part of that seems to be just, well, like Atlantis seems more like it would be a state, whereas Hyperborea would not be a state.
It's a completely different kind of state. Like, what a state you're in, like a palaver or a mishmash, or you know what I mean?
I mean, to be fair, I suppose a steppe empire is pretty Hyperborean. So it is.
Yeah, but it's still like a steppe empire. A Khanate is a conglomeration of people who've decided that they're going to follow somebody who's decided that they're going to follow somebody who's decided that they're going to follow somebody, more or less. And then all the other people got destroyed at some point. It's very malleable. Boundaries are liable to shift. People are liable to fall out, drop off, drop in. Compared to like an empire, that like a Western style empire or a Muslim empire or anything like that, usually they've got a lot of stuff written down, right? Sometimes even like carved on stone, and it's sort of like here we go. Stone is a big thing. Like a steppe Khanate can have cities, but they're not going to be. They're only going to be trade centers, if that makes sense.
They're not so much centers of administration. And I think it's administration and bureaucracy. Those are the things that tend to, like, that. Yeah. That's more of like an Atlantean thing, or,
So next episode, China, the most Atlantean country in the world.
To be fair, to be fair, this Hyperborea Atlantis thing, I tend to associate that more with the Western Hemisphere. The Eastern that there are other things like in the Pacific there was a lost sunken land called Mu, and I would tend to associate that more with East Asia. And then you also have Lemuria in the Indian Ocean. So I think maybe we can talk about that some other time. Although I don't know about it in as much detail, obviously, because I'm more focused on Europe and so on. But like there is like a northeast southwest thing going on in the world as far as like cultural and spiritual stuff goes,
It's true.
So yeah. So, are we happy with that then?
I'm happy with that. I thought that was a tour de force. I thought, very good. Enough in depth. I mean, there's almost infinite depth that you can go into on these things. You'll never really exhaust all of the intricacies and the general pattern was like this, but when you zoom in really, really closely on this particular episode, actually, it was completely the other way around. You get weird stuff happening where people are just not sort of acting the way that you might expect when you try and apply these broad brushstrokes to everything. But generally, I think that was very good.
Thank you. So hopefully we will explore this Hyperborea Atlantis dichotomy a bit more in depth, maybe go into more specific examples of each, maybe aspects of each one, and maybe do some comparisons and so on. And you're planning to talk specifically about... I've been talking a lot about migrations in this episode, and you're planning to talk about migrations to Britain next.
Yeah, I was going to do a similar thing. And funnily enough, because I didn't know when we started this off, I didn't know that Conor was going to be doing Hyperborean Atlantean kind of thing, but that's kind of what my one's ending up being, as far as Britain is concerned. Yeah, it's just because as you've pointed out, when you look at the migrations into Europe, and it's the same story for Britain as well. Well, there's only so many directions that people can come from.
Yeah.
Generally, they can come from the east or they can come from the south. There's not that many people migrating south from the north into Europe or east from the Atlantic Ocean into Europe, funnily enough. So you end up with a very similar picture, obviously, for Britain, where you've got Hyperborean tendencies coming in from the east, and more Atlantean or Middle Eastern, or however you want to, distinguish between those, coming in from the south.
Mm-hmm.
And you see this kind of, they kind of chop and change over time. You get a bit of a rhythm going on, and then some disturbances. And yeah, so that, I think I'll be doing that. God, I don't know when we'll be going to be doing the next one. It's right at the end of July now. Sometime towards the end of August, it seems.
Okay, right.
I love how specific I end up being about this. Yeah, we'll do it. Yeah, in like 2 or 3 weeks. It'll always be at the same time. We're always going to start at the same time, which I believe is 3 p.m. UTC. But yeah, whether we're going to stay on the same day or anything like that, or do them every 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I don't know. It remains to be seen.
Yeah. Okay, well,
Right.
Thank you everyone for listening. Wishing you a very good evening.
Good evening, and
or-
also a merry summer if you're actually having one right now.
Yeah. How's the weather with you anyway? Like at the moment?
Better than how it is with you, I can tell you straight up. Having been in Scotland just a week or two ago, like that was shocking. Crossing the border, and suddenly, oh look, there's blue in the sky. Wow! On the way back into England, like, yeah, damn. Don't envy you guys.
That's really sunny out here, so.
Is it? Okay,
Yeah.
well, you're on the fucking good part then. We played Glasgow. That was shockingly dismal compared to how England has been.
As the West
Actually,
Coast.
England's been pretty crap as well, I've got to say.
Right. On that note, so thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.